Thank you all for coming and waiting while Simon explained to Time magazine about presumably Prigogine being assassinated, or don't you have a theory yet?
Well, yes. Anyway, can I say just great thanks for waiting. Sorry I was late. And it's partly to do with the rain and partly to do with an assassination in Russia.
Yeah. Excellent excuse. So the book, really the motto of the book could be this lovely line you've got: everyone counts or no one counts. So women, obscure tribes in Mali, clans, lots of groups of people who've been ignored, you cover. And it's like Journey to Outer Space. It's quite an exhilarating read. I can't believe how you did it all. And it was ambitious. How did you pitch it to your agent?
Well, gosh, I love this bookshop, by the way.
It's good, isn't it? You haven't even seen the fish.
I know, I'm just looking, it's just so lovely. And I love the city of Canterbury. I've never been here before.
Wow.
This is all very exciting. I'm a little dazzled.
Stay over next time.
But
you haven't even been on the rocking horse.
This book, The World of Family History, to sort of sum it up in the most simple way possible, was totally insane as a project. And it's the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most exciting. And the plan of it was this: what I said to my agent, which is the good question. I said to the publisher, I've always been looking for a certain book, and the book that I was looking for, I couldn't find. And I always quote Benjamin Disraeli, who's one of my heroes, and he always said, when I can't find it, when I want to read a book, and I can't find it, I write it. Yeah. And so the book I was looking for was this. I love world histories, and many of my great friends write world histories, and many of the authors you have here, I know, have written great world histories. But the disadvantage of world histories is that they're very distant from individuals often. And there's lots of trade routes and earthquakes and medical discoveries and empires and migrations, but the individuals are missing. And on the other hand, I love biographies, and biographies are getting bigger and bigger and more detailed. As you know, the new Neil Ferguson's biography of Kissinger. Yeah, is 1,000 pages before he's even met Nixon.
Oh God!
Yeah. So the new biography of Stalin by Kotkin is going to be 4,000 pages by the end. So I love the detail, I love the intimacy, but my idea was to combine the two, to find a way to do a world history that combined the span and reach of global history, but the intimacy of biography, and that was the idea. How to do it?
Yeah. Did your wife, who is Santa Montefiore, you may know, the novelist, did she ever say, this is a bit ironic, you're writing this great family-based history, world history, what about my writing time? I mean, you said it was a COVID book, but my God, it must have taken up a lot of your...
my wife, Santa, whose books are hopefully in this shop somewhere.
Absolutely.
She's very sick of the world, and she's very glad, she's very glad it's over. And my children are pretty sick of the world, and they're also very glad because I wrote it in COVID, and I just lived like a monk for 2.5 years, the 2 years of COVID, and wrote it from dawn till dusk every day. The big problem was how on earth to find a way to do the mission I'd set myself. And my mother, who was in her 90s, God bless her, said, after a bit, she said, Simon, I've got one bit of advice for you. Give the money back. She said. And she died before COVID, so she never saw I'd finished it, but it's dedicated to my parents. But anyway, I didn't get the money back, and then I had this idea about family. And as Martin, you've touched on it at the beginning in the first question, family is such a wonderful means of telling world history. First of all, it's something we all have in common. We all have families. Family can mean so many different things. It can be mum and dad with 2 children. It can be a religious unit, a political unit, a kingdom, an empire. It can be a family company. It's incredibly flexible. It's a great way it's a great harness, a tether, to be able to tell great things, to be able to tell great movements, to talk about ideologies and religions and the founding of empires. And it ticks many boxes about what I call the new history, which are exciting to write about. I think you said it's diverse, it's inclusive.
Yeah.
One of the things I decided was that, I would write about the royal families of China or Japan or Benin or Congo, exactly as I would write about the Habsburgs, the Kennedys, the Cecils, the Churchills, or whatever.
Yeah.
And once I had that idea, I realised that's one meaning of everyone counts or no one counts. Treat everyone exactly the same. Don't overemphasise any area, but include everything. So of course it works just as well in Africa as it works in New York. And so that was part of it. And then female history.
Yeah.
Now this is a very female history, and of course it's about family. And families are always changing. They're so affected by medicine, by economic developments, by work, and of course, women appear, are heavily covered in this book, and as are children, and they're left out of all books.
I think there should be a Netflix series, however, about your family, and I wondered if that makes you gives you more of a global viewpoint than some, I don't know, Utah Europa. Can you tell us, wasn't your mother basically illegally trafficked somehow?
Yeah. What happened was, I am the child of many illegally trafficked people.
Basically.
Yeah. We were a load of migrants. What happened was, we've escaped from many different things. My father's family, Montefiore's, escaped from the Inquisition in Mexico City and went to Italy and took the name Montefiore in about in the 1590s.
Why did they take that name?
They took the name, I think, just because it was a beautiful name. It may have been a village they lived in. It's a Tuscan name. They went to Livorno, and there are a lot of villages called Montefiore around there, and we never changed it. A lot of Jewish families, when they came to England, we were a Jewish family, changed their names, but we didn't. We kept it. And also my father's family was SEBAGs, which sounds kind of like Fleabag, the TV series, but actually in Arabic, it's an Arabic name, of course, so in fact it's SEBAG, but I'm not going to ask you to call me that. But they escaped from Morocco in the 1820s, where there was suddenly a bit of local difficulty, and then my mother's family were from Lithuania. They were Jews in the Russian Empire. Some of them came from Odessa, some from Lithuania, some from Poland. But that was all under the rule of the Tsars, the Romanovs, and they were very persecuted. And in 1903, there were the Kishinev pogrom, launched pogroms, anti-Jewish attacks all over the Russian Empire. And so my mother's family bought tickets to New York from Vilnius in what's now Lithuania, was then just Russia, and they got on the ship. All of them, my grandfather included, Henry Jaffe as he became, but Genrik was what they called him in Russia. He was a baby, and after about 3 days at sea, the people smugglers said, "We've arrived," and so apparently my great grandfather said, "But this can't be New York. Where are all the buildings? And besides, we haven't crossed the Atlantic." And so they said, "Oh, you see, look at the tickets," because they didn't read English properly. So they said, "Look at the tickets." And the tickets, they looked at the tickets. They said, "It says New York," and they said, "No, it says New Cork." And they were dumped in Ireland, and they settled in Limerick. And that didn't go well, because Limerick is known as Stab City in Ireland, those of you who know Ireland. And after about 2 years, they were attacked after a hellfire preacher gave a hellfire sermon in the church, and they told them to drive out the Christ killers. And it was a famous thing. It's the Limerick pogrom. If you look it up, it's kind of an interesting thing. Don't worry, you can answer it.
That's all right. Come on, we can all...
And so they, so they had to. Then they went to Newcastle and down to Nottingham and down to London. That's how I came to be. I came to be here.
Were you as amazed as most readers will be that the women are not well known? People like Semiramis, I don't know how to pronounce it. Melisende. Could you tell us about one of them?
Melisende. I mean, Melisende. One of the fun things about writing about the women in the book is, first of all, often to put women front and centre whenever possible. Another interesting thing is, just to look at the way they were described by very chauvinistic male historians, often male political rivals. And the classic example is Marozia of Rome in the 9th century, whose rule in Rome is known as the pornocracy, which porn as in pornography. Porn means prostitute in Greek. So the pornocracy is the rule of prostitutes. So Marozia was actually the senatrix and patricia and of Rome, and she ruled Rome. So we only know about her from the man, Bishop Luitprand of Cremona, who describes her as the greatest whore in Christendom, and along with her sister Theodora. But really between the lines, because that's all we have, is that she was obviously the Margaret Thatcher of her day, and she wasn't really a whore at all, though she did have a very colourful love life. I mean, she slept with the Pope, she killed the Pope. She murdered several popes. She was the mother, grandmother, and great grandmother of many popes, and she married 3 times, as well as being the mistress of one pope. And she was clearly a kind of, the word formidable. I sort of make sure I never use that to describe women in the book, because isn't that a cliche that you always see? Women are always formidable, but she was an impressive person, and so there's an example. So though it's filled with women that you'll know, Cleopatra and Catherine the Great and Indira Gandhi and Thatcher and so on, there'll also be many you don't know, like Empress Wu, like Marozia, and Melisande of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now Melisande is a fascinating character. She was Queen of Jerusalem, Queen of the Kingdom of Jerusalem during the Crusades. She was the daughter of Baldwin II, and so she was kind of French, half French. Her mother was Armenian. She was apparently very beautiful, dark, and she was a powerful character who had to marry a man, because there had to be a man to run the army. So she married a man called King Fulk, and he was himself quite a formidable person. But she's famous now because she built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as it stands today. So those of you who know Jerusalem, I wrote a book about Jerusalem. Those of you who know Jerusalem, who've been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or the market in Jerusalem today, those were both built by Queen Melisande, and so she was supposed to have had an affair with a knight. I think he was called Count Peter, and the knight was murdered, and the murderer was arrested because everyone said that King Fulk must have had him murdered, which of course he had, basically. But the assassin underwent extreme torture in order to prove that Fulk hadn't ordered it, and died under torture with his tongue ripped out and everything, which of course was useful, because after a certain stage he may have said something. Yeah. So ripping out the tongue was only kind of sensible. Yeah.
I just want to say, if anyone's intimidated by the book in all its 1,300 pages, I'm going to read a footnote out, which I think illustrates both Simon's entertaining grasp of English and the fact it's just very, very entertaining. And also the footnotes are quite something. Has anyone mentioned that? Just as Gibbon's footnotes are more entertaining in a way than Gibbon. Yes. These are Gibbonian footnotes. This one says, Procopius, legal official and obsequious court historians, in secret wrote anecdota a semi-satirical cross between the Daily Mail and Saturday Night Live, in which he accused the Emperor of being an avaricious, war-crazed demon, and Theodora of being, do you remember?
Yes.
A vicious nymphomaniacal.
Vicious nymphomaniacal vamp.
So lots of that sexism.
Yeah.
I mean, did you really enjoy getting the appearance of people? I remember when I was a history degree, there was a biography of Henry II, and his appearance was an appendix.
Yeah.
Do you think appearance and personality has really been neglected?
Well, I think it's really nice to have the personalities, and so I read really widely, and to find what I could about their personalities, because the whole point of this was to get close to the people, and so I always put a sort of little description of the person or something I can find that's fascinating, and people are fascinating.
Yeah. Do you think academics have derailed that grasp of the role of people?
Well, I think there's a sort of great fashion in the 20th century to show for thematic history, to say that structuralism, to say that power structures and themes are much more important than people. But we only have to look at our own era, like to look at Donald Trump, for example, or Vladimir Putin, to see that personality really makes a difference. And though they may not make a difference over centuries, they can certainly make a difference to people's lives over decades. And they generally are successful because they personify something that's already happening. And so, this book is another kind of skirmish in that discussion. But, I do think that there's no reason for history to be boring. But obviously I specialise in, reading very boring academic tracts and finding the juiciest bits in them and deploying them ruthlessly. Yeah. But with my history books, I work really hard. I sweat blood. First of all, my first sort of mission is really just find out what really happened, and to tear up whatever. Sometimes you have to tear up what you already know and what appears in. When I was writing about, starting with Catherine the Great and Potemkin, there are millions of books about Catherine the Great, and every one just repeated the same stuff that was in the old ones. And I was very lucky because I was one of the first people to work in their archives for a long time. Wow. And a lot of the stuff that had appeared in every single book about Catherine turned out to be entirely wrong. And so, that's the great thing about archives. So I've been very lucky that I've worked in archives in Russia and in other parts of the world, and especially when I was doing those first 3 books, which were really archive based.
Which we've got here.
Which you've got here, yeah. That's so nice to know. I mean, Catherine the Great and Potemkin was my first history book, and it was a book I kind of longed to write for a long time, and because. Under Stalin in the Soviet Union, Catherine the Great was kind of banned, but she was also banned really under the Romanovs because she was a bit of a family embarrassment because they were very Victorian and very prim, and she was just kind of she was a female libertine. So, and Potemkin was such an extraordinary character. I mean, obviously he was the most brilliant minister and statesman of the whole Romanov. 3 centuries of the Romanovs, but also he was so scandalous, and they were so scandalous. But how to handle them these days, because it's so unpolitically correct. Yeah. I mean, of course, firstly, they were Russian imperialists. So that's very, one has to say that first. And yes, they were interested in expanding the Russian Empire, which is why they, with Peter the Great, are Putin's great heroes. Yeah. But they'd have hated Putin, and
why?
They'd have hated him because he's first of all he's an ultra-nationalist, and they were imperialists. They believed in Russian Empire, but they weren't really into the nation. Internationally, nationalism hasn't been invented. They were children of the Enlightenment, so they really believed in tolerance. To give you one small example, Prince Potemkin travelled with an entourage that included several rabbis. And he loved Jews, which is almost unheard of in Russian history. And he also was the first man to arm the Jews since the fall of the temple. He actually created a regiment of Orthodox Jews as cavalry, the Israelovsky regiment, which is so eccentric. And so they had Jewish, ringlets and black hats, and they were riding on horses with lances and swords. It's unrecorded if they were any good in battle. They just fell off the horses. I'm allowed to say that because I'm Jewish. They may have been useless, but he still did it, and he was such an extraordinary character. Now, they were very scandalous. I mean, first of all, Catherine the Great. The stuff about Catherine the Great is she was not an nymphomaniac, but she was a serial monogamist. She'd had a very lonely upbringing. Her mother was a terrible sort of pain, basically an enormous pain, who embarrassed her throughout her life and had to be sent home from Russia for causing a diplomatic incident. And her father died before she came to Russia, so she had no family. Her husband was was horrible to her and sort of lacked all empathy, and so her lovers really became her family, and though sex was very important to her. And I would describe her as a sort of liberty, which is a nice way of saying that she loved sex. She also said, I can't be without love for an hour. And she was what we also call needy. And when she found Potemkin, he was exceedingly good looking and a sort of enormously sort of strapping guy, but he was also incredibly clever. An expert at all sorts of things, and forceful and haughty, and just 1 million people. And of course, they fell in love. They had this passionate sexual affair, which is all recorded in the letters that they wrote. And then, when their love affair began to sort of, because he didn't want to be a pet at court. He wanted to, rule the empire basically. So they negotiated a unique open marriage where they married, and each of them had young lovers. And of course, as they got older, the lovers got younger. So you can see why a lot of rock stars like Madonna and Mick Jagger loved this story.
Yeah.
Because they were kind of like, Potemkin was like a sort of rock star. But he was very talented.
Russian history, really important to you. So is Ibn Khaldun. You like him, don't you?
I mean, he's a fascinating character. Ibn Khaldun was a North African historian in the 1330s, the time of the plague, and it was him that wrote about the idea of asabia, which is solidarity, which is still relevant today. He said, a lot of societies and kingdoms and worlds collapse not because they've got any economic or military reason to fail, but because they lose the concept of solidarity. And I think that's very relevant to us today in our democracies, and that's one of the things I write about at the end of the book, because the book goes right up to now. It ends on the day, the main text ends on the day of Putin's invasion. And, by the way, Putin has stolen Prince Potemkin's body from Kherson in Ukraine. I don't know if you know about that.
No.
But, so, it's very interesting, this stuff. It's very relevant today. And I guess I finished, in the conclusion I finished by saying, history is very overrated, and people regard it as far much more important than it is. And what I mean by that is, I realized that Putin was going to invade Ukraine when he wrote, I'm sure you read about this, but he wrote an essay about Russian history, which he quoted Potemkin and Peter the Great and other people I've written about, and he said basically Ukraine doesn't exist because of this history. And that's when I knew he was going to invade Ukraine. And a lot of people said he wouldn't. A lot of people said, he won't, Russians won't invade Ukraine because, they love London and they only want to, come to Eaton Square and shop in Chelsea and that sort of thing. And I said, no, that's what you think they're interested in. What they're actually interested in is, power and their empire and Russia. And that's how it turned out. But what I meant about history is that, what really matters is how people want to live now, and not how people wanted to live 300 years ago. And so, it may sound strange for someone who spent their life writing history books for me to say that, but I think that's an important principle. But when you mention Ibn Khaldun, I think the thing about him is his brother was also a historian, but he was assassinated by a rival historian, which always makes me think of my bad reviews that I had over the years. And I've never heard in England of anyone being assassinated by a rival historian. Not yet.
No.
But it could happen in any minute. So I'll be careful what I say.
You talk about crowds as well being maybe more dangerous, because the book is full of a lot of pretty crazy people.
Yes.
And it's clear that's nothing new. But you talk about the danger of crowds when, insanity in one person. I think you quote someone. Insanity.
Nietzsche said it, yeah.
Yeah, do you remember the quote roughly?
Well, he basically said, insanity in one person's fine, but insanity in a crowd is a movement, yeah. I mean, I think, what I want to say about Ibn Khaldun, what I want to say is, history is kind of hugely overrated. But at the same time, we do have a sacred task. And the life of a historian is kind of fun in England or America or Western Europe when we're coming to Canterbury to talk to people. But in Russia, in Iran, in China, people die from history, die for writing history. In Israel and Palestine, in the Arab world, and so it is a sacred task to try and get this stuff right. And I'm not saying everything I do is perfect, far from it, but what I try and do in these books is just to get as close as I can to what really happened, not being affected by ideologies and not being affected by presentism. Like when you write history, you want to try and avoid writing really about your own time and imposing it on the past. Even though there are things in presentism, like I write a lot about slavery, I write about women. Those are sort of interesting things that have been underwritten.
Yeah.
And so you want to take the best things from the present, but you don't want to judge everybody by the very prudish and prim times that we live in today.
I think you've done a great manifesto in the front for history, which covers the digital distraction. I never read other people's books, so I'm going to read this sentence. History has become a spark wheel, its moral power instantly igniting torches of knowledge and dumpster fires of ignorance. One has only to glance at the hellscapes of Twitter and Facebook and hear the words of prejudices and conspiracies to see that history is ever more fissile. What was that word?
Boroughiami is a great word, which is when your stomach groans. That is that word.
And that's a bit like the digital.
It's a special word. Yeah, it's a special word. I like to write very simply, but I love to every now and then use a kind of crazy word.
But doesn't that make history all the more important, the fact that there are echo chambers on?
Well, it does that's why writing good history, is very important. In the beginning of the book, I quote Chinese history from a Chinese historian from the 1st century BC, and he was a fascinating character. He was the court historian of the Han dynasty, and he made a terrible mistake, and he was given the choice by the emperor. He was writing a world history, by the way, and he was given the choice by the emperor of either death by execution or castration. And he chose castration because he said, I want to finish my world history.
Wow.
And he said, I want my book to be read in many countries and stuff. And I had his quote by me when I was writing my book. But ladies and gentlemen, I'll reassure you right now, I finished the book intact. Intact. But history is terribly important, and yet, another example of history is I've written a lot about Israel and about Palestinians, and both those people try and deny each other's history. So the Israelis say, the Palestinian people have only existed for 60 years, so they're not a real people. And the Palestinians say, the Jews never had really had a temple in Jerusalem. There was no Davidian or Herodian temple in Jerusalem. It's all made up, and both of these things are appalling lies. But all that matters is that, like, both of them, both these people have essentially lived in this land for over 100 years, and so, they both have legitimate claims to these lands, to have their own country in these lands, and so history is terribly important. But part of the job of the historian, like me, is just to sort of wrangle people to what is actually the truth.
Yeah. And you notice, don't you, in the book several times, that everyone's always predicted the end of mankind as we are.
Yes.
From Gilgamesh onwards.
Yes.
Do you think that's because we're secretly quite humble about being here?
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Today we have more feeling that something terrible is about to happen, don't we? Everyone has an unsettled feeling that some sort of apocalypse is possible, and then when I started to study history, as Martin says, we study world history. I discovered that every civilization in every era was convinced that the end of the world was imminent, and so I began to wonder about that. And I think you're right. I think it's partly that we feel guilty for our triumph on earth. And partly we realise that we're fragile despite our successes, because we are still the playthings of climate and things and science and things we don't really understand. And so I think that these things, this sort of guilt, this fragility, make us feel that we're very vulnerable and that at any moment the world could end. I think today there's really more danger of it ending than at any other time, because of nuclear weapons, because of climate change, because of computers and AI.
You're all glad you came out.
But I'm actually I finish on an optimistic
you
note.
counter that with just how we've never been so healthy. I mean, what was the death rate in India compared to 1945?
I mean, we the great thing is we're living. We actually should have a kind of perspective. We've never been more healthy. Virtually all the diseases we die of are what I call diseases of success. We're dying of these diseases for most people, whether it's heart disease or Alzheimer's. These are diseases that people mostly get, in an age when, 100 years ago, no one was alive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a dizzying thought that if you look at someone like Peter the Great, he died at 52. Wow. Having kind of changed the world. Prince Potemkin, another one, 52. So, it just gives you an idea of how much people achieved then. Bearing in mind, how exhausting travel was. Yeah. They were just worn out. So actually, we're the luckiest generation that's ever been.
I've got two final quick questions, and I know everyone else has
got great
questions.
I don't know what time we started, but
with clocks all over the place.
Oh yeah.
One question is, which I've forgotten. The other question is, what was it that irritated Thatcher about your interview, and how old were you?
Oh yes. Well, when I was 17, I went to interview Margaret Thatcher. First of all, I'd interviewed Ken Livingstone, who was head of the GLC. Those of you who are old enough to remember that.
Yeah.
And after that, I thought, for my school magazine, which was Harrow School, so I had a connection to Margaret Thatcher because her son was had been at Harrow School. He's much older than me, but he'd been there, so there was a connection. So I just thought, what the hell? I'll write to her and just say, can I interview you? And to my amazement, I got a letter one day with Downing Street, and I ripped it open, and it said, the Prime Minister will see you on, present yourself at Downing Street. Amazing. And she'll see you. So I bought a suit because I didn't have one, and I went to Downing Street, and a policeman I remember it was so exciting, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
I went there and I said, to the policeman outside, I've come to see the Prime Minister. And he sort of went, really? And then he sort of spoke into his radio. And he opened the door. I went in, and very quickly I was taken through to meet the Prime Minister, and it was just extraordinary. She was very nice to me, but I, at the time, being an idiotic teenager, was regarding myself as a sort of Maoist. And so I'd taken Mao's little red book in my pocket. And you can imagine how all this went down with Margaret Thatcher. And so I thought to myself, I'm going to ask her really, kind of cheeky questions, because I'm not going to be impressed, because, So she sat down and sort of said, so what can I do, how can I answer your question? So I started asking all these questions, very kind of sitting there sort of like this. And suddenly, to my horror, she suddenly reared up, stood up, came to me. She was wearing her famous blue suit. She suddenly kind of loomed over me and said, pull your socks up. And I said, like, what do you mean? I didn't know what she meant. And I was sort of sitting there like this, very kind of show. I was very unimpressed, And she said, no, I mean, pull your socks up. And so I actually sort of, I actually pulled my socks up like this. She stood and she said, and the other one, she said. So I pulled up the other one. And then she went and sat down again. And so I was slightly frightened of her after that. And I have questions, certainly, my Maoist plan was slightly I slightly kind of dampened it down. But afterwards, apparently, quite recently, they opened the archives, the Thatcher archives, and there's a very funny bit. I knew this had happened because her private secretary I met a few years later. He said, by the way, there'll be no more schoolboys invited to Darrington. That's to you. And I said, oh really, why? And he said, like, you really took it a little too far, and you were a bit cheeky. And I said, really, what did she say? And she said afterwards, she said, no more schoolboys. And she said, he basically said, you were very impertinent. Very impertinent. And that's also apparently it's in the archives. It says there's no more schoolboys. That one was very impertinent.
You have got some great matriarchies in the book, though, in
yes.
places like Mali. Did you ever think, as you were writing it, and you came up to Putin and Trump and all these psychos, that we'd be better off with some of those ancient matriarchies?
Well, the thing about women is, as I said, it's filled with women, and it's also filled with appalling men. So people often say to me, would it be better if the world had been ruled by women? But, of course, if they were all like those wonderful ones in Estonia and Finland, in Sweden, of course, if they were sort of Nordic women, peace-loving, tolerant, of course it would be better. But actually, the women I write about, they're every bit as talented, as peace-loving, as murderous, as incompetent as men, and so actually they're very similar to men, and actually they're no better or no worse. So I guess if you look at someone like Empress Wu, of China, of the Tang Dynasty in the sort of 6th or 7th century AD, she's a terrifying person, who murdered her own children and other people's babies in order to stay in power. And all sorts of other things, which I don't know you well enough to tell you. They're so shocking, but they're in the book. But I just sort of she's a brilliant person. Obviously, just a sort of she must have been absolutely brilliant, but was she a good ruler? No, she was a brutal, ruthless. Scary character, and there are many examples of this in the book, and so I try. There's a huge tendency at the moment, because of the way history is written at the moment. People are writing and making TV series the whole time where they kind of they sort of come to some woman and they kind of immediately claim she was like, absolutely wonderful, peace-loving, a philanthropist, a lover of humanity, and actually. It's completely untrue. So one's got to be very wary of imposing on the imposing history, imposing the sort of obsessions of the present on history.
Who wants to impose with a concise question? Since I pushed.
Please ask anything.
Yeah.
Or nothing. You can all have a glass of wine.
This gentleman's going to break the traditional silence.
Okay, you mentioned Uzbekistan and you mentioned Mao's Little Red Book, and you mentioned Russia. How do you think the dynamic relationship between Russia and China is going to change, and has changed perhaps? I know in the past you talked about Russian rulers looking east and or west, and I wonder what you think might happen now.
Well, it's a good question. It's a great question. I mean, one of the things that's happening now is a diffusion of power. So we used to only think of, we only used to pay attention to these great powers. And the world has really changed. The biggest change that's happening is that, I guess, the period of the Cold War, which I call the sort of 70-year peace, the first part of it was like really a double act between the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and America. And it resembled a game of solitaire, a game of chess. Then there was the American period, the American period, the unipolarity of America, really after 1985, when America really dominated the world until about 2010. So for about 25 years. And that was really like a game of solitaire. America really set the tone for everything. And now it's like a multiplayer computer game. And there are a lot of new powers that are behaving in a way we've never seen before. Obviously some of them are huge, like India, which is going to be a superpower at any minute. Maybe it is a superpower. And some of them are sort of, people at places like Indonesia, places like Nigeria that have huge potential, but at the moment are a total mess. And then there are a lot of small powers that are really what I call continental powers. From UAE to Bahrain to Saudi Arabia to Israel to Turkey, Iran. These are all continental powers. They're now exerting power. They're not just following one bloc or the other bloc. During the Cold War there was a non-aligned bloc, but they were really kind of aligned with the Soviet Union. It was a bit of a lie. But these continental powers now have their own policies and play bigger powers off each other. So that's an interesting development. So Russia was always dominant over China for a long time. Then they became rivals. Then they fell out in the 70s, big time. In the 60s and 70s, big time. Then Russia fell apart, and China rose meteorically and became one of the great, almost the greatest economy in the world, along with America. And by the time that Putin and President Xi met just over a year ago, before the war, and declared themselves partners without, allies without limits, it seemed like China was completely dominant. China's rise seemed exponential, inevitable. Actually, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia began to look very weak. China looked much stronger. And yet a year later, it's clear that peak China has passed. And China itself has huge economic challenges and economic problems. It's a moving picture. China is still, it's much more rich and powerful than Russia. But the thing about Russia is, Russia's weakness has been exaggerated. I mean, we judge Russia by ourselves. And all the time we're saying things like, Russia's lost hundreds of thousands of people. They must be about to kill Putin at any point. Not really. Russian leaders really don't care about this sort of thing. And if you don't care about it, it doesn't destroy you. The fact is, the Russian army is colossal. It's resisting so far. It's holding the line so far. Its tactics have improved enormously, and the Ukrainian, with all the weapons we've given them, Leopard tanks and so on, Ukraine is advancing with grinding, bloody slowness, and really it's a stalemate. And so, even though Russia, we're constantly with wishful thinking, saying, they must be so weak. Aren't they about to murder him at any moment? Well, not necessarily. He could rule for a long time. When he does fall, he'll either get ill, or he will be killed by people close to him, or overthrown by people close to him. But that could be a long way off. And so Russia's, you've got to realise, like, the scale of Russia is just like enormous. The spaces, the people, you've got to realise they have more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world. We made a mistake under people like Obama when Obama said, Russia's just a petrol station with nukes. That attitude was very unwise.
Someone else?
Good question.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a serious risk of Putin and his supporters taking it so far as to attack Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, maybe even Poland, but those first three on the grounds that he would consider them and they would consider them as part of Russia, like they regard the Ukraine and Crimea?
Well, yeah, I mean, without NATO, that would definitely happen. And, as you know, those countries where my family comes from, and Poland, were all, it's an interesting thing. We think of Poland, for example, as part of the sort of, just an inevitable an inevitable republic in Europe. But, Poland didn't exist between 1796 and 1918. It just didn't exist. So, things change. And we think of there are many countries, and you'll see when you read my book, there are many countries that were huge powers for centuries in Europe. Like, for example, the Khanate of the Tartars in Crimea, or the Commonwealth of Lithuania, Poland, you've mentioned. They vanished after hundreds of years. But because of NATO, that would obviously trigger a world war. So I think they'll think twice before they do that.
Two more questions. There's one here.
No, a bit of a cheeky question. I'm Italian, and looking at your surname, I was a little bit disappointed that there's not a lot about the Kingdom of Naples. I was a little bit surprised that there's not a lot covered on the Kingdom of Naples, considering, especially towards the end, most of the lead thinkers, they helped Franklin and Washington to draft the American constitutions. So is there a reasoning behind that?
You're absolutely right to accuse me of this. You're absolutely right to be cheeky. I have to make the Kingdom of Italy is in there a lot, obviously, and Italy is hugely important, is all the way through the book. But you have to make this sort of, with a book like this, you have to make brutal decisions. Sometimes Naples suffered from my brutal decisions, and you're absolutely right. And the people who really have big complaints are the Scandinavians. So I'm glad that I don't know if there are any of them here, but I'm ashamed to say, they have more to complain about than you, because Italy. I mean, obviously Roman Empire, but also the Renaissance and so on. The Borgias, the Medicis. There's actually a huge amount about Italy, but there may not be much about the Kingdom of Naples, but there is some.
Well, that's about
ask your next cheeky question.
There is about 500 years of history that they're only marginally covered by the footnotes.
You have to make brutal decisions with a book like this, and oftentimes, I'm actually more worried about, for example, the countries that I really wanted to put in here, because there's so much on Italy. I'm respecting your comment, but I'm more worried about the fact that I left out much of Thai history, because I'd love to have done Thai history, and I'd love to have done Madagascar history in the book. But with Thailand, for example, I had to make a decision, and I chose to follow Cambodia. And all the time I was making these sort of decisions, which of course, are kind of annoying if you wanted to read about your country and where you come from. So I apologise for that. But one has to be able to drown kittens to write a book like this.
Oh, this lady's got a question.
It's probably a stupid thought, but if the mind of a woman is not quite the same as the mind of a man, if the world had been run by women, would they have made tanks and guns and knives and all the weapons that are used?
Well, it's not a stupid thought, or it's a very good thought. But the only evidence we have is how women behave when they were in power. And, you know, female leaders like Maria Theresa, Empress Zenobia, Marozia, Queen Melisande, I mean there are so many, Empress Wu, they were all great warlords, and they were just as keen in waging war and just as successful, and just as keen about sponsoring innovation, technical innovation in war, as men were, or Catherine the Great, for example. So, you know, Catherine the Great, you know, she sort of ran sort of 3 huge wars, for example. You know, she won all of them, by the way. But, you know, so I just think it's an illusion that we can understand it. I think people are formed by where they are in the world, not just by their sex. And I think people are formed by, if they find themselves in power, they adapt to power, and power is a question of is often a question of war. You know, and
war drives things, doesn't it? War drives innovation.
Well, I mean, the reason why, I mean, people sometimes say to me, you know, why has the book got so much sort of torture, murder, war in it? And I always say, actually, it's filled with poetry and art, and you know, it's got
jesters
and jokes, and it's got Mozart and Lady Murasaki and Beethoven and all Hafiz from, you know, it's filled with poetry and love and all that sort of thing. But the reason why you know, war, there's a lot of war in it and a lot of violence, is because you only have to look at Ukraine today. You know, look at the war there. Look at all the technical advances that are happening because of that war. In drone warfare, for example, you know, and missile warfare. You know, these are things that are all happening because people, all the cleverest people in these countries, and all these countries are working to try and improve ways to kill each other better. And that's true if you look at Leonardo da Vinci, you know, like, you know, if you look at his life. I mean, you know, what people really want, yes, they want the most prestigious artist in the world to make sculptures and make paintings, but what they really wanted were these people to work on fortresses and weaponry, and that's what their employers demanded, and they all did that. You know, Michelangelo in Florence, you know, he's rented by the Republic not to paint, but to design battlements. So, you know, technology, war is all about technology.
Churchill drove it, didn't he?
And Churchill was fascinated with new warfare, and he had imagination, he had ingenuity, he was creative, and the greatest rulers are like that. You know, I think Putin is a very boring person, a very banal person. I don't think he is one of those people. He's no Churchill. He's not even like a Stalin. You know, Stalin was much more talented, but you don't always have these kind of flamboyant, powerful characters in office.
One last question.
Good question, though.
Yeah, thank you. One last question from somebody. Yes, this gentleman.
I just wanted to ask you about your research for this book.
Yeah.
You said you did it during COVID, and earlier you said that's when you used to do archival research. So did you mainly do the research through lots and lots of reading and access to texts in the COVID period? And did you, post-COVID, did you need to access any archives?
Well, that's such a good question. You know, when I was writing my first 3 books, I wrote them in the Russian archives. And I was very fortunate with all 3 of them, because when I published my Catherine the Great of Potemkin, Putin had just been made president, and he was very fascinated with how Catherine and Potemkin took the Crimea and Ukraine. And so I was approached by his people, and it was thanks to, and he read the book, and it was thanks to that, they arranged it to be translated into Russian, and then he read it. And then I was approached, and they said, would you like, Mr. Putin would like to give you a present. Now, that isn't always a good thing. But I said, what might that be? And they said, I don't know if you're interested in Stalin, but we're about to open the Stalin archives. Would you like to be the first person who works in the Stalin archives? And so that's how I wrote my books on Stalin. But when I published the first book on Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, which was the book that was my breakthrough book, you know, sold all over the world and so on, but Putin hated it. And so I lost my access to the archives. And when I went back to the archives and said, can I come back in? They said, we don't know you. You were never here. And I was like, I was your favourite. I was there for 9 months. And they said, yeah, well, maybe you were, but you're not coming back. So that was the end of my special access in Russia. But the point is that with this book is, and then I wrote, the Romanovs book, and that was research in the archive, and Jerusalem. But this book is a work of synthesis. With a book like this, you're really using a lot of other people's work and a lot of other people's research. And wherever possible, I was using primary sources, most of it, but of course I don't speak Chinese, I don't speak Mandarin, I don't speak Arabic. So mostly I was reading things in translation. So what I did in lockdown, I started the book in lockdown. I might never have written it but for the COVID epidemic. And what I did was I just ordered hundreds of books from secondhand, from Aid Books and Amazon. And the one thing that worked was delivery still happened. And so I got all this, and there's a picture online, I don't know if you've seen it, of me with all my books in my office, because I piled them all up by region. And so I was able to do the book that way. I mean, there is a lot of primary sources. Wherever possible, I used letters. And wherever possible, I used my own research, things I'd found myself. But that's how I wrote it. So I wrote it all then. I was constantly reading new books, and now I'm just reading thrillers because I'm so I don't want to see it. I don't want to see another history book.
Well, that was amazing. I think.
Can we just have?
Oh yeah, yes.
Can I just ask you which languages you speak and how you handle this avalanche of material?
I'm not a great linguist. I studied French and Russian. And neither of them am I brilliant at, but both of them I can use to do research, and I have used them to do research. And everything else, I either employ people to translate things. But the real thing I did with this, the real sort of breakthrough I had with this book, and which has really been the thing that's made me in life has been my ability to take criticism from people who know more than I do. And when I started to write my Catherine the Potemkin book, I was very young, and I'd been a war correspondent in Russia in the fall of the Soviet Union, which is an amazing thing to do. But I was almost killed several times, and I thought to myself, I haven't even got a girlfriend, and I'm only being paid £200 for this article, so I'm going to write books instead. So I came back from Chechnya, and I started to write that book. And I wrote to the most famous specialist on Catherine the Great in the world, who was called Professor Isabel de Madriaga. She was an amazing person. She was incredibly abrasive and rude and imperious. And I gradually realised she looked very like Catherine the Great in old age. And I gradually realised that she thought she was Catherine. And I realised this particularly when I went to Kherson in Ukraine, which you may have heard about. And I was going to visit his tomb, Potemkin's tomb. Potemkin and Catherine were the great lovers. And she said to me, she sort of seemed a bit bashful at the end of one of our sessions. And by the way, in our sessions, she was absolutely brutal. I mean, she totally taught me how to write a history book and how to analyse sources. And she was just amazing, and I actually loved her. And we were great friends. And when she died, I was heartbroken. But then she said to me, you're going to Potemkin's tomb? I said, yes. She said, would you lay some red roses on this tomb? So I did. So the point is that she taught me to take criticism. By the way, Putin stole that. Putin stole the bodies. As I said, which is fascinating. But anyway, so that was a real lesson. So I'm not proud. So when I did this book, rather than having thousands of researchers do stuff, I decided to order all the books that I could, in anything that was in English that I could, and then because I'm not an expert in China, for example, some things you can learn about European, you can write about Germany, but China is so different, and so I wrote to all the great specialists in Harvard, in Princeton, in Oxford, and I said to them hi, it's me. Would you mind reading the section on,
Which is brave.
Of course I complimented them. I flattered them, of course. I always said, like, your book's right beside me here, on my your book's on my knee. My hand rests on it as I write. And some of them just said, get lost. Some of them said, what I did was, I didn't want to reveal to anyone how I'd done this book, because it's so unusual how I've done it, as you'll see if you read it. So I just sent them their sections, cut out. And because I'm very secretive when I'm writing a book, because anyone can steal the idea or reveal it online nowadays. And so some of them wrote back and said, like, this is completely spasmodic. I can't understand it. I refuse to help you. And then other people said, you write. I don't like the way you write this history. I'm an academic. I don't want my name mentioned in the book. But here are my corrections. So I was very great. I didn't care about that. I was thrilled. And then the most generous ones just said, of course I will. I'll read it. I correct it. Please, do mention my name. And so that's how I wrote this book, and that's why I think it's a good book, because and when they criticised me, said it was wrong, I did whatever they said. Also, I had some amazing things in the book. I mean, I'd known some people like Margaret Thatcher and Henry Kissinger, Shimon Peres, Shevardnadze. I'd known some famous statesmen of my time. So I put on my own conversations in there. And I knew the Queen, I was very lucky that I had dinner with her privately, so I wrote about her as I knew her. And these things are all in the paper. Some of them I slightly cowardly didn't put in the hardback, but put them in the paperback, because the Queen died. There was a tradition that you never wrote about the Queen. You never quoted the Queen, but you never sort of wrote about her. But she died between the hardback and the paper. So the description of the Queen is my own description of her. So there are a lot of fun things in the book, and there's a lot of corrections by a lot of very grumpy historians.
This is so great. We're so grateful you weren't beheaded like Walter Raleigh when he was writing
All castrated.
All castrated.
Yes.
Thank you. This could go on for much longer, but we must move to the signing session now. Simon's going to sit here. The book is £5 off, which makes it cheaper than a pizza.
I can do the pizza.
Do the pizza as well.
Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Do come and say hi.
I'll take that. Thank you.
That was so nice. Thank you very much. Very nice. Thanks for having me, Martin. Yeah, I will bring you a top hat. Okay.
Yeah, I've got sharpies. Oh, great, thank you. Move the radio. I'll keep one under the radio. That would be great, but I'll get it. Hello, how are you? What are you going to get?
And this is to Dennis and Des. That's like, thank you so very much.
Can you do this one to David, my son? He's doing a PhD in He's struggled through COVID to access the archives.
Which archives?
He was doing, he's doing it on World War II era. So King's was one. National. I can't remember what. Because I'm not listening. Yeah, I'm sure he will. I'm sure. No, it's okay. Thank you.
Somebody's hired to carrier.
Yeah, no, I love the idea of it.
Great, got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do sometimes. Hi. I do, but I want to talk about history. But I don't, But I do. I hope you enjoy it. That's you.
Timing is everything.
Oh, good. Hello, how are you? You sort of see Griff's eyes. I can imagine he's a bit of a box from my side. Well, thanks so much for coming. Hello. So in the end, just the top just he went with it, too long. So you see the look in his eye, you go, nah, you're staying to do something else. You can give it to somebody else.
And you don't wear a scarf. Oh, was it?
Enjoy. Hello.
Hi.
There are a lot of ways to split Oh, really? Thank you. I hope you enjoy it. Yeah, thank you very much. Oliver. But I think there are two things. One being comparison. I've run it past my regulars. Oliver, I hope you enjoyed it. Less outshine two things. That's what I think. Do you want to give this a go for November? We're advertising far enough ahead. Thank you very much. Thanks for let's be honest, I've read well, yes. I heard that, yeah. But one doesn't want to think one's been made a fool of in such a significant fashion. I've made mistakes. Hi, how are you? Oh, well. Just today, I think we're going to say that it is. There are a lot of things in the book. That, of course, yes. It's not a popular name anymore.
But it's fantastic.
I'm working here. I work. Do you? And we just choose a book. I usually get about so do you teach? No, I work in here. Oh, you work in here? Yeah, not this branch, but I want to do it. Oh, okay. So I'm thinking of suggesting this for November. So do it. You can write. I'll write this room with you.
Oh, here you go. I'll try that. Perfect time.
I know you need to prep.
It was meant to be, wasn't it?
You're on an absolute winner. Yeah.
I think it's up.
That's the one you wanted.
Well, no, it's okay.
How much is it? This one's 10. Do you want that one? Do you want me to get you that one as well? It was 15 and it's reduced to 10 because we had a ticket for tonight. So, you've still got
Oh, well, there you are. Yeah, well.
Hi, who's next?
Hello.
this lovely gentleman.
How are you?
I'm okay, thank
You
you.
ask a very good question.
Well, I had a few more. I don't know.
He says he asked
Some of them may be answered in the book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could I possibly get a picture of you both together?
Yeah,
just for
of course.
Roger's wife. I'm sure she'd be delighted.
Yeah, do you want to what that?
There
Oh, yeah. What the hell?
you go. Fabulous. Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Roger, thanks for coming.
Do I get one of those here or somewhere else?
Yeah, here.
They have got one. Yes.
Roger to Roger.
Yes. Yeah, and I'll go pay for that one. Can I ask you a very quick question while you're signing? Because you strike me as a man who can multitask. Martin said at the beginning, don't be daunted by the size of it. Were you under any pressure or was there any thought to maybe do it